Keith, just a bit of background about yourself first, mate. How you're a writer, a journalist. How did you get involved in this Scott Watson case?
Well, that's a good question. It's 20 years ago. How did I get involved? I don't know. I think it's just through being a journalist and seeing a story and getting the feeling and then investigating it and discovering that it's all a piece of nonsense.
So when you got involved and started to investigate it yourself, what year was that?
About 2000, well, it could have been at the end of the last century, at the end of the trial period. Could have been 1999, but a good more than 20 years ago now.
So were you in the court when the original conviction happened? No.
No. I've always been in Auckland. Everything I've done has been talking to people involved and looking at the documentation.
So did somebody get in contact with you after trial and say, Keith, I think there's been a miscarriage here, you need to investigate this, or did you do it of your own volition?
I think I did it of my own. Yeah, I don't think I spoke to anybody else to get started. I would have, as I say, it's 20 years ago, I would have made a lot of inquiries before I decided to go any further. So something about it at the time made me uncomfortable. That's all I can say. I can't recall the exact thing.
You don't know what actually was the trip, but you looked at the case. Who were you working for at the time, or you were working as an independent journalist?
Independent.
Right. So you're a freelancer. It wouldn't have been easy being a freelancer 20 years ago, I have to say. So you wouldn't have made any money out of this. You investigate?
I did all right. I did the film, and the film, of course, supplied a director's fee and a research fee. And then the book has did reasonably well for that sort of book too. So it's not made me penniless at all.
Okay, all right. You did. So what do you do first? Do you do the movie, or the documentary, or do you do the book, or do you do newspaper articles? Which comes first?
The first thing I did was the film, the documentary. And a year or two after that played, I thought I hadn't... you can only do so much on television, so they're always truncated. But if you do a book, you can put everything in. So I did the book as well.
Okay, all right. Now, moving on, what is the first piece of evidence that you went, this just doesn't work for me?
Oh, boy. Quite possibly to do with the lack of evidence against Watson. I mean, there isn't any. The principal reason he shouldn't be in there is there's no evidence against him. And I suspect that discovering that would have kicked me off. The only so-called evidence was, to my mind, absolutely extraordinary. The only evidence that the police brought to court were two hairs that they'd found, that they claimed to have found on a blanket on his boat. Now, the story of the two hairs is extraordinary. They got this blanket off his boat, and they went through it with a fine-tooth comb looking for blonde hairs, long blonde hairs, as the missing girl had. And they didn't find any. And this was in January of whatever the right year was. January, 1990-something. And they didn't find any long blonde hairs. And then 6 weeks later, they had another look. And bingo, there were two long blonde hairs that they'd not seen on the blanket in January. Somehow, in the next 6 weeks, those two long blonde hairs had materialized on the blanket. And that's the first thing I think that got me going, because I don't know how that could happen. And it seems to me absurd that two long blonde hairs cannot be seen on a blanket when what they're looking for is long blonde hairs.
Okay. Now, that blanket was on board Scott Watson's boat, the Blade, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, and that connected, therefore, Scott Watson, the Blade, and Olivia Hope and at that point. And I imagine that DNA evidence of the time was critical. I can't imagine a jury being influenced by anything other. If I was presented by that, it would be guilt, and obviously that's what the jury found, yeah?
That is, well, as I say, it's the only evidence against Scott Watson that was put to the court. There was no other. Nothing else allowed him to be convicted. Nothing. So it's pretty important.
Oh, absolutely. And everything else that might have been botched, whether or not there were, the recollections of those who were there, of eyewitnesses, which we now know is notoriously inaccurate, the way in which the police conducted themselves, the deliberate leaking of information against Scott Watson and his family by the police, which I think is now generally acknowledged. All of that, put that to one side. Most New Zealanders always came back to, New Zealanders, not people in the court, but people who are just watching and reading or listening, came back to that DNA evidence. You are therefore must allege, Keith, that was planted deliberately by the police.
I prefer not to make the accusation, but that's open to an imagination.
Well, how else did it get there? Unless
I don't know. But quite plainly, they looked with a fine-tooth comb. They went over that blanket looking for long blonde hairs and didn't find any. 6 weeks later, they looked again and they found 2 long blonde hairs. Now, you tell me how that can happen. I don't know. But that's what happened, and that's what he got convicted on.
Okay, yes, I agree. So this week, his lawyers are going to the Court of Appeal to argue that there are questions around that DNA evidence, presumably both its finding, as you've suggested, but also the accuracy of being able to put that hair and its testing in that place. Do you give them much chance of success, given all the unsuccessful court cases to this date?
Look, I don't know. I've just had, since I got contacted by your friend, I've just had a quick browse through my book. I don't know how anybody can be in prison in the face of what the book says occurred. I just don't understand it at all. One of the most puzzling things to me is that there's so many witnesses said they'd seen this catch that it was all happened on. The police case was that there was no catch. Over and over again, there was no catch. And the prosecutor in court, Davison, said over and over again there was no catch. Well, I don't know how they can say there was no catch when they had at least 10 or a dozen eyewitness accounts of the catch. And there's something about it that really gets to me, that so many people saw the catch and had information that favoured Watson. And the police, and they took it to the police, and the police constantly said, we're not interested. Over and over again. This witness said it, this witness saw it. And the police kept saying, we're not interested, we've got our man. Now, that happened quite early in the piece, and the police had decided on Watson within 8 days, within 2 days of Inspector Pope's arrival. They already knew who the guilty man was. Now, I'd like to know how they knew that. And I'd like to know whether or not that's the reason they kept saying, not interested in anything else. We're not interested in anything that points away from Watson. And so it does seem to me that they made up their mind at the beginning that Watson was guilty. And the only way they could possibly do that is that they knew that somebody told them. I think hidden away in police archives somewhere, or in Inspector Pope's mind, is some sort of document that says Watson's guilty. And they could only do that if somebody told them. So I think there's somebody around the place that was involved in the disappearance and had sufficient contact with the police to tell them that Watson was the wrong man. I think there's a whole heap of nastiness in behind us somewhere.
So you think that it's not as simple as the police simply botching an investigation or coming to a prejudicial early decision? You think there's much more complex than that? I do. And that's after 20 years contemplation of it. I do. I don't think it's as simple as the police making a mistake at all. It cannot be. There's something caused them from the 8th of January that year to tell everybody, we're not interested in your information. We don't want it. We're not interested. We don't believe there's a kid, so we're not going to look for it. There's a reason for that. It can't just happen like that. Something told them, or there was a reason for them to turn all of the information down. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, I got a contact with a retired lawyer who had been in the Sounds at the time, and on the morning following the disappearance of these two, he saw a ketch, like the ketch that didn't exist. He saw a ketch heading out of the bays in the right direction at the right time. And he called the police a few days later and to tell them. And the police were not interested, he said.